Australian Wealth Builders, helping time-poor executives build financial independence through property investing.
Oh, welcome back, Cam McLellan. I have with me once again a good friend and business partner, Michael Beresford. Boz, how are you?
Good, thanks, Cam.
This series is actually coming together quite nicely. First, we nailed out. This is actually the third part in this series. I'm not sure how many more there's going to be. I reckon we might have a couple more up our sleeve in this current series. So, first of all, we outlined what it takes to set yourself up for success, which is defining your goals, really understanding what it takes to invest and why. Then we went into setting up your team and delved into pretty deeply into the right finance structures and why finance structure, well, most people are scared about finance and it could be the most daunting part for most people. Once you understand exactly what you need to do and why, you get clarity over it and therefore it takes the fear out of it. But now the rubber hits the road, mate. We're going to get into the MAP process, which if people don't understand the MAP process, and the MAP process is something that we developed probably 15 years ago. I'll be clear on this. If you see or hear of the MAP process anywhere else, it's been stolen from us. So this is a painted, custom designed investment process, which is the opposite way that most people pick property. So talk us through, mate. What's the most common way people would go out and pick a property and what are the pitfalls? And then we can delve into why we created the MAP process many years ago.
Zero criticism here. We're going to have a little bit of fun with it because people are only doing this because they're motivated to improve their situation. But they probably talk about it with their partner on a Friday night. Hey, I think we should be, the property market's moving. We could make some money here. We should go and buy one. Oh, yeah, I saw this beautiful one around the corner. It's actually up for auction tomorrow.
Yep.
So get their coffee, walk around the corner. Oh, it's where we live. We can see it. We love it. It's a great spot. We love it. Why wouldn't everyone love it? Pay more than 6 other people bidding at an auction to buy the house.
Yep.
And because it's at auction, the contract's unconditional and then you've got to worry about getting finance. And they hadn't even thought about getting a loan.
Paying more than anyone else is not a good investment strategy.
Not where I come from, but it's like I said, we're going to have a bit of fun with it. That's typically what people do. So if we bring it back to being serious for a second, they make emotionally based decisions. Buying property that they love in an area that they know without necessarily the due diligence on what they can borrow or what they can afford.
Yep.
And that's generally the process that they go through.
Yeah, and they fail to solidify in the first 2 parts of this series. They've just basically wiped out any of that first part. They've jumped straight to auction mode or buying mode or talking to an agent, and they're down the rabbit hole of actually buying a specific property way before they've worked out why they should do it, how they should do it, the structure they should do it, the finance structure. And I'm guilty of this too, mate. This is probably about 8 months ago at my next door. It went up for sale and I wandered out there and found myself putting my hand up for no other reason. Felicity goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "I don't know. I just got excited." So, so you do get excited at auctions. There's no doubt about it.
That's exactly what they're there to do, is whip everyone into a frenzy and, the barriers come down and, people spend more than what they can sometimes or what they should to buy. That's the agent's job.
Yeah, and sorry, I wasn't buying it for an investment property. I was going to dump the thing and put a tennis court on there, but Felicity told me I'm being stupid. So
good thing you've got her.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, just around buying, the numbers show that about 10% of the Australian population invest. About 7% of that 10% have one investment property. So that's 70% of investors in Australia have one investment property.
Yep.
68% of investors have a property in the same postcode they live in.
So it's a common pattern, isn't it? Just buying in your local area, somewhere you're familiar with.
Yep, because they think, well, property's worked well for me, I'll buy another one. Now, The 2 issues with it are the fact that let's strip it away from property and let's just talk logically and say, right, well, from everything that we know about, financial performance and so on, does it make sense to have all of your property eggs in the same basket within a 1K radius when you consider the size of Australia?
Yeah.
And most people pretty often say, no, that doesn't make a lot of sense at all. That's not an effective way to maximise my outcome, but it's what most people do.
And it's pretty hard if you think of the 10.5 million properties around Australia to know that one around the corner from your house just happens to be the best one, the best investment for you at that point in time. It's throwing a dart at a pretty wide dartboard.
Yeah, indeed. And the second thing that we can learn from those numbers is that, like we talked about in the last episode, one property is definitely going to be better than none. It'll beat the pension.
Yep.
But one property is not going to be sufficient, regardless of how well performing it is. It's not going to be sufficient by itself to be able to achieve most people's goals. So while people buy a property around the corner from where they live, the big gap for them comes in understanding how they can actually springboard from that into the next one, into the next one, into the next one. So I think there's two parts here. One is the actual process that we go through.
Yep.
And I'm sure we'll do another episode on duplication and portfolio management and so on.
Yep.
But fundamentally, it's about understanding not only property selection, but how that property can be a building block to allow you to get another one and another one.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think when I come back to the reason we developed the MAP process early days, I felt most people were investing, like I said, using the dartboard analogy, but literally it's probably more dangerous than that. It's like driving a car in heavy traffic at 100 Ks blindfolded. That's the way I visualize the way most people pick property. You got the biggest investment choice of your life and you don't follow a process whatsoever. So it's literally like jumping into a car and hurtling down the road at breakneck speeds with no comprehension of how to stop or steer. And that's why I think we developed the MAP process, because if you think of I think it was about 9.5 million back then properties. I think it's about 10.5 million properties in Australia now. I wanted a process to be able to take property A and compare it with property B. And this is all based on trying to find the best property for me at this point in time, regardless of market cycle, but then getting the winner of that, comparing with property C and working through to get to the point where I know that regardless of any property or any market, I've got the best property for me at that point in time, which is specific to my investment plan, which was getting 4 or 5 properties to get me to my end goal. So it's all got to marry back to that original goal. And I think as we go through the MAP process, while we talk about property selection, we'll go through the market area property process. If we think of the fundamentals of what you've been talking about is being able to duplicate, and we'll get into that, but really to achieve real wealth, you need to be able to hold the most amount of asset with the least amount of money out of your back pocket. So there's so many factors of why we're going to be talking through the specific strategy of finding the right property. So there's method in the madness, and while there's process just to go, supply and demand is what most people think about when they think through the MAP process, but it's just so much deeper than that when people go through it.
Yeah, I think one of the ways I've seen most people fall down over the years with their investing is they buy at the wrong point in the cycle, because like we talked about in previous episodes, they're focused on the headlines they're hearing in the media. Humans are naturally drawn to a fear of missing out. And when things are flying, that's generally after the market's been on an upward trend for 3 or 4 years prior.
Yeah.
It's the happy days that'll never end.
Yeah.
And most people jump into a particular location thinking, I'll try and get rich quick. I can make some money here.
Yeah.
It tends to be the wrong part of the cycle to buy in.
Yeah.
And it then takes them much longer than what it should for them to see any growth in the property. 10 plus years, the property hasn't really grown. They think, this property thing doesn't work. So that's where I think the real benefit of the MAP process is. It's a constant process and checkpoint to be saying, well, we don't have a crystal ball. We'd love that the market started booming at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We don't have that. But the MAP process, I think, is the closest thing that we have to a consistent check and balance on where is the right place to be investing at the right point in time relative to what you're wanting to achieve, to make sure you get it right as often as possible, and the track record underlies that.
Actually, track record is a good thing to give people a bit of knowledge of the street cred that the process has. If we think about the 1,500 odd families that OpenCorp deal with, a submission to ASIC for one of our funds 2 years ago, we had to do a full analysis of every single one of those properties and compare the results and the growth and rental yield of those properties and match it against 8 capital city averages. And the results was a 37% increase in our clients' portfolio over the average house in Australia. So, the facts in the figures, the process works time and time again to get the best outcome for clients.
I think the point that you mentioned there around time and time again is a really important one. It's, within this property industry, it's so easy to be caught by the next big thing, or, it's like, oh, my mate's got this tip in race 4 on the weekend, and you think, oh, unreal, and all rational decision-making goes out the window for a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
By all means, have a bit of fun on the weekend. But if we're thinking about spending several $100,000s on properties, and it's, hey, I can get an amazing cash flow positive here in a mining town. We've also seen the stories on 60 Minutes where, when the rainbow stops shining, it's a fair bit of hurt.
Yeah.
And people that clearly, were sold the blue sky weren't ever discussed risk or risk mitigation, market fluctuations, or the fundamentals that actually drive markets.
Yeah.
One thing I'm really proud of is that our process hasn't changed in 20 years.
Yeah.
All the properties in my portfolio fit the MAP process, and they're exactly the same kind of thing. So it's not like, apartments were the rage 3 years ago, and then I bought a townhouse last year, and I might look at a duplex in 2020 because of COVID.
Yeah.
Like I say, it's like grandma spaghetti bolognese. Don't mess with the recipe, just follow it. I'll repeat it when you can.
No, safe and slow. Get rich. The old saying, get rich quick, equates to lose money fast. So you're right about, and you hear it, see it time and time again. I think even APRA and the government put the handbrake on investors by increasing the requirement for lending back in February 17, when 60% of the purchases in the Sydney market were interest-only loans. So investors trying to speculate and get rich at the back end of that market. And the government saw the writing on the wall. But the average mum and dad rookie investor, all they'd seen is property prices grow for a couple of years, the newspaper articles saying nothing but good news about the market. And as we know, during any growth period, the one thing that's happening in the background is developers are buying, acquiring stock, and it takes about 2 to 3 years to get that stock to come to market. So through this massive growth period, what you get at the back end of that market when it's time to cool off is large amounts of stock getting dumped onto the market, which is where you see a price correction at the back end of any market. Now, that's not a bubble as the media would then report it. You might get 40-50% growth and then a 10% reduction, which is uncertainty that's expected. But that's like you said, people are speculating at the wrong point of the market, as opposed to understanding that lots of smart, small investment, boring investments picked at the right point in time. And the old saying, Warren Buffett, the French guy, Warren Buffett, is one of his greatest sayings is, be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. So once you've got some growth in a market, let the market run, but take that equity out and put it into another capital city market, which is next poised for growth. And therefore you can catch the perfect wave. Or as a decent surfer would know that they see the swell coming before the wave's even formed. And that's what, as an investor, that's what you look for. You look for the swell that's building in the background, as opposed to seeing the wave crash in the media headlines. The MAP process. So if we reverse engineer it, like you said before, most people go out and buy a property in their local postcode. Let's reverse engineer it. What we're looking for in the concept of the MAP process to get down to that individual best property is a process of elimination. So knocking out large portions of options that are not good for investment at that point in time. And the easiest way to knock out large portions of potential investment options is to look for capital cities that are not good for investment at that point in time. So we've obviously got now a lot of people don't have an analytics and acquisition team that work for them full time. So you can understand that this is probably daunting, but it's something that needs to occur if you're going to, be a smart long-term investor. So we've given some basics that people can use in the back of my 4-year-old, The Property Investor, which is there's a check sheet, which is a market review form in there, which looks at looking at the last number of years median house price growth. So if you're seeing double-digit figures for multiple years in a row, it's a reasonable indication. Not having an acquisition team that can tell you the amount of stock versus the amount of demand on the market at that point in time, that's probably a good indicator. You want a capital city market that's had constant population growth over 2% per annum. Australian Bureau of Statistics is a pretty good spot to get this. It's a terrible website to navigate, but you can get it from there. Looking for the unemployment rate, not looking for the best unemployment rate, but looking for something that's dramatically high. And we talk about employment in the sense of, diverse employment. So lots of blue collar and white collar workers together. Most capital cities have that, but ensuring that the area you're focused on has those factors, and then really determining at what stage of the cycle that capital city is at. Is it, like we said before, is it that really hot end of the market where where people have got their confidence up and to start buying, or is it in a quiet stagnation period? Because that quiet stagnation period is the bit you want to be investing in, so you can get the next growth cycle.
Yeah, I think if people are investing to make money, right? So it doesn't make any sense to be buying petrol at $1.50 a litre if you can get it at $1.30 a litre.
Yeah, there you go.
So it's much better. I've seen a lot of people over the journey try and time the market perfectly, and they'll research things for 10 years and not have actually bought anything. But if they just bought something that was, an average performer 10 years before, they would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars in front. So,
yeah.
Don't think that the MAP process is something that will drill down and give you, the best possible winner every single day of the week. What it is about a process you can follow to have exposure to the right kind of locations with the best possible growth potential.
Correct.
And ensuring that you are, you'd much rather be 12 months too early than 12 weeks too late.
Yeah, that's so true.
Because with interest rates where they are, and the fact that the rent and the tax benefits will pay for these investments, it's not actually costing you anything out of your pocket to be in the market waiting for that next growth cycle.
Yeah.
If you come in 12 weeks too late and the market's gone up, then that's tens of thousands of growth that you've missed out on already.
Yeah.
So one of the big mistakes I see people say is, I'll wait till the market moves and then I'll jump in. By the time you hear about it, you've missed out on growth already.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think the concept of investing over the long term, that's once you've crystallized that this is a 15-year plan, for example, I'm quite comfortable that some of my properties sit there stagnant for 4 or 5 years. That's part of the waves that you go on. So having that property sit there for that period of time, knowing that it's ready for the next growth cycle, and getting in, then taking that equity out and moving into another capital city, and knowing that once that property's had that growth cycle, it's going to sit there for a little while. I'm better off to hang on to it and let it sit there, like you said, at no cost or positive in cash flow at that point in time, and just build that portfolio, keep building those small, solid investments along the way. Yeah,
the example I used, my first one in Perth, Perth hasn't done anything for nearly 10 years. And my mates are like, you still got the one in Perth, Perth's doing nothing, why don't you sell it? So, it's putting cash flow in my pocket on an annual basis. Yeah. Perth will come back. I'll still have it when the Perth market goes through its next growth phase.
Yeah.
But because I bought it right before the major boom happened in Perth, that property got me my next 2 deposits.
Yeah.
And so 2 things on that. If each property gets you your next 2 deposits, then it's done its job. You're going to have a portfolio that allows you to create the wealth you need to achieve the goals that again, most people have got. The second thing is that would have really sucked if I'd bought like these investors did in Sydney, chasing dollars at the start of 2017 in a get rich quick. If I'd bought it at the very peak of the Perth market and the property hadn't done anything for 10 years, then that'd be a terrible outcome.
Yeah.
But because I was in before the market growth occurred, it's a lot easier to hold it long term and just keep it ready for the next growth cycle.
Yeah, well, you think about the Sydney investors who got into the back end of that market when the market's hot. It's already had its growth. You've got the next 7 to 10 years sitting there waiting for the next growth cycle to come. No wonder people get disillusioned with property investment.
Yeah, exactly right.
And I think I was probably lucky, and you could do no wrong in the late 90s and early to mid 2000s in the Melbourne market. You could buy any piece of shit really. And, pardon the French, but you could do no wrong. As a dumb, stupid young investor, luckily that I was guided by someone with a lot more grey hair than me. But when it came time that the market had moved strong enough, he said to me, it's time to pull your equity out and move to another capital city. And it took me a long time to get my head around that concept. I'm talking at least a month to get my head around that concept before I started investigating it, which is a long time for me to actually be confused about something and not sure how to do it. Do you know what I mean? But as soon as I was told that I need to take that equity out, move it to another capital city market, I could see the benefit. And that's when we really started to develop the MAP process and document it. In the early days was, catching the wave in one, the growth in one capital city market and moving it to the next one. And that, we're getting into duplication phase, but really that's the reason why we invest in multiple capital cities. So, and using the first part of the MAP process is knocking out those capital city markets that might be in the headlines at that point in time, but we're still advising people not to go there.
So maybe before we move on to area, let's give everyone listening an example. We talked about how Sydney was at the peak of its boom about 3 years ago. It had seen that major growth phase. So no surprise, Sydney's not somewhere where we would be investing at the moment based on the MAP process. I guess the whole fundamental of what that looks like is if we think about what drives growth in capital city markets, these are the fundamentals that I want to help, we talk about helping people understand that the media don't write about. It's really supply, demand, jobs, affordability, government infrastructure and spend / stimulus and lending policies.
Yep.
So when we look at all of those and we use net interstate migration as an indicator of the people movements and where people are moving for jobs and affordability. Sydney has had the biggest net exodus in the last 3 years since the peak of the cycle, based on that affordability and people moving elsewhere. So when you understand what those people movements do, there's a reason why the capital city markets follow each other in a fairly set way from one growth cycle to the next. Net interstate migration is just an example of that. So, if people don't have their own research and analytics team out there and want to know the kind of indicators that we're looking at, that's a pretty good one to consider.
It is a good point you make. So, and I've always used Sydney as a lead market indicator because Sydney and Melbourne are driven by business. That's what drives the economy and therefore the affordability. And affordability is one of the three factors with supply and demand that drive price growth. Sydney being a bigger business hub usually grows first and then Melbourne follows, which is where we slotted our clients straight into Melbourne as soon as the Sydney market had gone and watched them get the growth out of there. The Perth and Brisbane market work similarly, but out of sync because they're largely driven on mining and tourism. Now, less and less, actually, Brisbane is getting driven by tourism over the last decade, but Perth's definitely still strongly driven by the mining, which is going over there. The funny thing with Brisbane at this point in time is it was due for growth pre-17 and started to get some of that growth. Then obviously the lending regulations slammed down because of the Sydney market cranking. But even through the COVID period, we've seen Brisbane fight against all odds and started to get some solid growth regardless of what's going on in the big wide world. So it's good to see the markets responding and that supply and demand pressure as an investor really starting to take off for some people. If we peg it down now and we go, all right, we like a couple of capital city markets, so we've knocked out some pretty large portions of Australian options, and we start looking at the area, some of the things to consider. What we're looking for is growth corridors which have limited supply and long-term demand, so long-term population growth forecast. So there's a few things we can look at. If we think about and talk about the type of employment that we might be looking for, what's some of the, you obviously did, your team put together research reports on these areas. What's some of the types of employment or employment hubs that you need within those growth corridors that you'd be trying to identify?
Yeah, really what it comes down to is understanding the government strategy on where they're investing money and why. So one of the things that I've heard consistently over the years is how far is it from the city? And I used to answer the question, and now I say, why is the distance to the city important? And very few people can actually answer that, but they're getting along the right track when they're saying, well, that's where the jobs are. The CBD was where all the jobs were back in the 40s and 50s, and that's why it's been drilled into us that we need to be close to the city. But with the population growth and urban sprawl that we've had, over the previous decades, government strategy is really about investing in these mini CBDs in the suburbs, or principal activity centres as they call them, which are really focal points for employment creation, amenity and government infrastructure and spend.
Yeah.
So now that you understand this concept, just think of wherever you're listening, think about if you're living in one of the capital cities in Australia, just think about where those jobs and so on are located within the suburbs, these mini CBDs. And chances are, nearly 100% of the time, the major infrastructure projects that are being rolled out feed people into or out of one or more of these principal activity centres.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, it's the. I used to draw it out when I was looking for the amount of supply. So I used to actually draw a straight line towards the CBD and look for large tracts of land or areas that could, bring in more supply into the area, because most people wanted to live and move towards the CBD. It has, over the last 10 to 15 years, that's changed towards, and you've got to do a lot more research into each of the capital cities, but you've got to be doing that not just to the CBD, but towards every one of the activity centres. And they're called slightly different things in each of the capitals, but
yeah.
So once we've got that factor, let's talk more about the amount of owner-occupiers that you need, within an area. If we exclude, every suburb is going to have an amount of townhouses, and specifically around, train lines and those sort of things. If you exclude those out, talk through the owner-occupier, percentages that you might be looking for.
Yeah, cool. So look, 70-30 as a number is what we're looking for, biased towards owner-occupiers.
Yeah.
If we go back to one of the previous episodes where we were talking about what holds people back and, where they need to be to where to start, the biggest fear that most people have is, what if I don't have a tenant?
Yeah.
So the reason why the owner-occupier percentage is important is twofold. Number one, it's just a different version of supply and demand. So if you are restricting the available supply in a particular area of rentals, because the predominant percentage or predominant properties are owned by owner-occupiers, then that just means that we've got a high demand area, because if owner-occupiers are living there, chances are it's going to have all the things that you need.
Yeah.
But we've just got a relative shortage of rental supply, which means not only are we mitigating our vacancy risk, but we've got an ability to be able to drive rental up over time as well with those incremental increases we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
The second thing is, let's take a step back. You only ever want your investment to do two things, and that is to bring in cash flow and grow in value. So restricting rental supply, we've talked about, that's bringing in the cash flow, making sure we've always got the rent coming in. From a growth perspective, we need to understand who's responsible for telling us what a property is worth. Mm-hmm. Now, if we're buying and selling that property, it's going to be, whatever the market determines, at auction or private sale. But if we are holding that property and extracting the equity, as we talk about, Cam, to duplicate, then the valuer appointed by the bank to do that valuation is the one responsible for telling us how much equity we have in a property. So we really need to understand the process they go through to determine what a property's worth. Now, they're not doing a market assessment. They're not gift wrapping this thing for us, because they need to churn out 9 or 10 of these valuations a day to make a living. It's a very quick and dirty assessment of value based on mitigating their risk, so they're conservative, but looking at comparable sales with land size and bedrooms at the most basic level to put a number on what your property's worth. Therefore, this is where, when people get emotional, they fall down, because they overspend on stuff that doesn't ever get any benefit on a valuation, given the value is not setting foot in the house most of the time.
Yep.
So in short, you've probably heard of, buy the worst house in the best street. That doesn't mean that we're buying poor quality houses by any stretch. Really what that old saying is getting to is get your location right and don't spend too much on the house, because it's the part that drops in value.
Yeah.
Be in the right location for value around those owner-occupiers who have typically spent more on their own homes than what we have on investments. And those superior properties pull the value of ours up. That creates equity, and we're on to our next property from there.
Perfect. So we've got, talked about employment generators, supply between where you are and an activity centre or the CBD. You brushed on briefly there vacancies, and vacancy rate is one that, the vacancy rate within an area, and most of the capital cities, the vacancy rate is really under pressure at the moment. We're looking 1% in most of the areas we're looking at and investing, but that's not always the case. So I think probably a more relevant measure that sort of helps regardless of where the cycle is and what the vacancy rate is, really time to lease. So, within 4 weeks time to lease, you want to be making sure that you can, if not, there's either, your property's priced too high, there's too much on the market at that point in time. So when it gets to knocking out the area, there's some pretty big ticket items that people don't think about. The things that most people think about when they're considering an area is what the local real estate agent will promote is all the amenity. So look at the schools, the local, private and secondary and primary schools in the area, and look at the shopping convenience, major local retailers, public transport, parks, local sporting facilities. Look at the fantastic amenity around. I mean, very important. You want to tick the box, but we build pretty good cities. Most areas have got all the local amenity. So while most people focus on a specific area and consider the amenity, they do so because it makes them feel emotional and reminds them of home. Because most people live in a capital city have got all those amenity around them. So they're ticking their own area box. But if we focus on the employment generators, the supply, owner-occupiers, and then if we look at some of the value indicators, you brushed on it before. If we think affordability, supply and demand, we've talked about supply and looking at the supply between the area and the activity centre, saying there's huge amounts of land that can come onto the market and reduce the amount of demand in the area. If we look at new infrastructure, so budgeted infrastructure, I think is important when we're talking to local councils, and investors need to be out talking to local councils, looking at council planning maps, whether it's state, federal, and in those individual council zones, looking at what infrastructure is budgeted, because new infrastructure, being roads, rail, that brings population. So, and if you're bringing more population to the area, it puts more pressure on supply, and you'll get long-term population or long-term price growth. So you can see now as the process goes, we knocked out capital cities that are not good for investment. We're looking for the worst of those sort of growth corridors to knock out large portions. So we get down to one or two growth corridors within a specific capital city that we're happy with. Let's delve into the property. Now, you brushed on it before, which I think, and they do all interlink. We talked before about valuers and ensuring we're getting the right valuation and understanding how to get the right valuation. If we talk about what is a good investment, it's really something that's going to grow in value, and buying under the median house price enables the valuer to look and establish what the benchmark is in the area and be satisfied attaching the value that you require to that investment property. Now, while I think it's important, if we look at if you sign a contract, usually when the contract goes through, the valuer at best will put contract price on it, usually based on obviously them being conservative and covering their own back, will put 5 to 10% lower. And anything more is something to be probably questioning. But what we're trying to do, buying under the median house price, is giving ourselves the best chance for down the track to getting an uplift in valuation and creating a bit of instant equity. So a couple of years down the track. So really ensuring we're buying under that median house price is one of the mantras that we swing. Talk us through the established capital benchmark and why that's important to understand within an area when you're trying to pinpoint the right property.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll use an example. So let's say that the median house price of an area is $700K, for example. When we talked at the start of this episode around flipping the normal property selection process on its head, remember, if people are making an emotionally based decision in the suburb that they live in, chances are they're going to be spending more than what they should. So this is a really common mistake that cohort of investors make that haven't actually thought through this process and applied a process to their investment decision. If the median house price is $700K, then you can have two properties in the same suburb or even the same street that will actually perform very, very differently for you from a valuation and therefore equity perspective. Let's say that the median property in the suburb is a 450 square metre block of land with a decent sized, nice big 4-bedroom house on it. And so that's the one that's around $700K. Now, if you've got an investor that's gone out and bought a property that's, say, on 600 square metres of land and maybe has 5 bedrooms because it's really nice and it was newly built and it's close to the cafes and the schools and the shops and all the real estate marketing type stuff, there's every likelihood that you could spend $850 on that property. Yeah? But it's beautiful. Who wouldn't want it? It'll always have a tenant. All these things are how people justify it. The problem is, how many of those really nice big 5-bedroom houses spec'd out to the same level are there in the suburb? Chances are not many. And if there aren't many of them in the suburb relative to other properties, then how many of them have sold? Not very many, which means the value has got no direct comparable sales upon which to assess your $850K property. So what are they going to do? they look at the most comparable properties, which are going to be down around the median level, to give themselves a confidence that if this thing had to sell at a fire sale on Monday morning, how much could we get for it? And they might put 720, 730 on it because it's slightly nicer than the median.
Yeah.
So you've got a really nice house, but based on the valuation, you've actually gone backwards from an equity perspective rather than creating equity that you can then use to duplicate into your next property. On the flip side, let's say you're really smart about what you buy, and maybe you buy a 400 square metre block of land with a decent, serviceable 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, double lock-up garage property on it, nicely specced out because it's got to appeal to a family tenant.
Yep.
No dripping gold taps or marble floors because we're not over-capitalising here. And let's say that your purchase price was $620,000. Now, when the valuer goes out to do the same valuation assessment, if most of the properties are around that median price, then those slightly larger but comparable, slightly nicer but comparable 4-bedroom homes around the median are going to be the ones that the valuer uses to compare your property with. So the proximity of those owner-occupiers that have spent a little bit more on similar but slightly nicer houses is actually pulling the valuation of ours up. Now, I'm not saying that you get $700K on the val, but you might get 680 or 685.
Mm-hmm. And
that's created equity that you can use towards your next deposit. So, when you hear things like location, et cetera, and you make money when you buy, all of that kind of stuff, that's real estate speak for trying to create demand and emotion around, people's activity at auction and so forth. Where you actually make money is understanding the valuation process, leaving emotion at the door, but getting optimum size and quality and ensuring that you're buying to value around owner occupiers that have spent more than what you have.
Very, very true, isn't it? I think an example we've used in the past when people tend to get emotional about it, and we obviously explained it a lot nicer than this. I'll do it really quick and hard and fast, as if I was explaining it to one of my family members, so I can be a little bit harsher. But if we talked about overcapitalising, most people do. They want a bit larger bedrooms, or you often see, the team in the office with tape measures measuring out different floor areas, and what they're doing is basically trying to find the optimum size and quality property for a specific area. So a really basic example would be if you've got a dining area and you've got 1.5 meters behind you, but you can push your chair back in 500 mil, and then you've got quite a nice sizable area behind you. You don't need the extra whole meter. Half a meter might be fine. So if we take the length of a house being 20 metres long, and we can trim off 500 mil off the side of it, well, that's 10 square metres at $1,000 a square metre. You've just saved yourself 10 grand. So if the functionality is no difference, the tenant won't know any difference on the size. It's still spacious and it's still nice. It's a new size home, but the valuer doesn't value on that, and you won't get any more rental income because the valuer looks at the amount of bedrooms and the tenant rents bedrooms. So unless you're going to get back, every $1,000 you spend, that plus more in valuation, then really you're taking that money, putting it in a steel rubbish bin and setting it on fire. And I think optimum size and quality is really important when it gets down to that area, because people talk about don't overcapitalise, but no one actually explains what that means and how not to. And I think there's a big difference between saying the words and actually doing the opposite.
Yeah, and optimum size and quality doesn't mean, please don't mistake that for cheap and nasty and small and boxy, because it's not.
Yeah.
It's just efficient and effective. That's the really important part to consider. And the other thing is that the optimum size and quality for suburb A is very likely to be different to the optimum size and quality for suburb B.
No, true. Exactly right. Which is why the team are in the office with tape measures most days, measuring out different suburbs in lounge room sizes. So there's some method in the madness. New over old, I want to pose something up there, because I've bought lots and lots of established homes over the years, early days. In the last 15 years, I've only purchased new homes. And I think there's a couple of main reasons, but run us through what your thoughts are on the main reasons why you buy, and I know you're the same, you buy new as opposed to old nowadays, but give us the big hitters just for people so they can comprehend it.
Yeah, there are 5. So the first one, given it's just what we've been talking about, is you have the option to be able to design it yourself.
Yeah.
You can get optimum size and quality as opposed to just taking, whatever the builder wants, or if it's an established house, whatever's there.
Yeah.
That's the first one. The second one, or the second two, are around cash flow. So you can get more rent for a new property than an old one. And I can also get more tax benefits by maximising my deduction, specifically depreciation, on a new property than an old one. So where the strategy is getting compound growth by holding as much asset as possible, as Cam said, return on investment is how much you make for how much you spend. So if you can minimise your expenditure by maximising the rental income and the tax benefits, being the income that come from other people, that's how you get effective investments from a return perspective. The third one, stamp duty is a handful of one of the non-deductible costs. So if you buy an established property, you pay stamp duty on the whole purchase price. If you build new, you only pay stamp duty on the land. So I'd much rather keep that extra tens of thousands in my pocket to be able to go towards my next deposit. The fourth one is the biggest reason why I invest in new stuff. And the reason for that is maintenance. Maintenance is the biggest black hole to your cash flow. I live in an old house. We love it. It's expensive. And if you spend money on maintenance, you can't recoup that from the tenant. You can't say, oh, the rent's going up $20 a week at the next release because I had to put a hot water service in it. As the landlord, you've got to suck it up, and that's part of the maintenance of the property. So any maintenance expenditure is cash flow that's just going out of your pocket. And whereby that might not be a big deal on one property, but if you've got 4 or 5 or 6 of these and you're doing that, every month or every second month, you've got a significant maintenance expense, that can really hurt your cash flow and start to impact your lifestyle as opposed to holding these properties for nothing.
Yeah. Number 5, tenant appeal.
Oh, yeah. So that's in the rent. More rent for a new property generally means you'll have more competition and
perfect. Yeah.
People prefer to live in new than old.
Yeah, 100%. No, I just wanted to cap it off for listeners. So I think we've rushed through the MAP process as best we can today. Hopefully we give people the concept that there's a process when it comes to picking the right investment property, as opposed to Uncle Bob at a barbecue told me to go and buy one down the road, or I roll up in an auction and get excited because I thought about buying an investment property that morning. So trying to get the right property for you hinges back to your original goals and why you needed it, but follow a process, and there's work involved. But think about the work involved that you would do for your normal job, working 40 hours a week, making money for someone else. If you had to spend 200 or 300 hours to go through and find the right property based on the MAP process, you're going to get a much better opportunity to get really good results down the track. Or if you can't be bothered spending that, well, you can utilise Michael's team. So there you go, Michael. I've given your team a plug for you.
It scares me when you call me Michael.
It's when I get professional, when I start talking, when there's clients involved, I start calling you Michael. Mate, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it once again. I think this is going to be a great series. If we bring you back at a later stage and we can talk through portfolio management and duplication, which is where we get exciting and start using terms like compound growth.
There we go. My favourite.
Yeah, that's
excellent.
Right.
No worries at all, Cam. Vote one MAP. Get on it.
Cheers.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and may not be relevant to your personal situation. You should seek advice from a licensed professional before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned, and opinions and views expressed may not reflect those of the Smart Property Investment Network.